I have so many executives that I coach through the coaching side of my practice who will say things like, "Oh, I've got a salesperson who is so squeaky, and they keep coming into my office like, what have you done for me lately? And they want more and more and more, so I just keep throwing money at them, but I can't keep doing that, right? I can't keep doing that." And then I'm like, "Well, is money what they care about?" And they're like, "Well, I don't know. Mm-hmm. I mean, I assume so." And I'm like, "Yeah, well, why don't you figure out what they care about?" And with almost every single one of them, it turns out that
there's something else.
There's something else. Like they care about working from home on Fridays, or they care about manifesting those values. So let them work from home. Put them in charge of your corporate philanthropy, right? If you give them, $10,000 to give away at the end of the year to a charity of, that the whole team votes on, suddenly they're super happy, and it's a whole lot cheaper than the raise that you keep giving them that then puts them back in your office every day. You just have to have those real conversations.
All right, welcome everyone to another episode of the Jake Dunlap Show. We are very excited that you joined us. If you haven't tuned in, this is the show where we talk to celebrities, thought, and industry leaders to really discover their journey to success. I am super excited that you're joining us. This show is like no other. I can promise you that. You might laugh, you might cry, but you will definitely leave inspired and gain a whole new level of insight into those people that you follow, love, and admire. All right, so like we do with everyone on the show, we talk a little bit about the early days and the things that helped to shape us. So talk to me, obviously, born in Queens, then moved to Miami really quickly. So what was the kind of early life like for Laura?
Yeah, so early life was actually living on an Air Force base. My dad was a surgeon he was the doctor for some of the astronauts that were in the space program that went up to the moon. So that's kind of cool, right? I wish I remembered it because I was like a year and a half or 2 years old then. But then this is sort of a funny story. The service said, well, Dr. Gassner, we are going to release you early. You don't have to serve 2 years. You only have to serve a year and a half. We can either send you to Oklahoma, or you can take your chances and find, a job in the private sector. And my dad put on his uniform and got in his car and drove to Miami. His uniform was the only fancy thing he had to wear. And he drove to Miami and he interviewed with a bunch of medical offices. And so that's how he ended up in Miami. And I spent my formative years growing up in Miami during the Scarface era.
Yeah, the 80s. Yeah, that 80s era. Yeah.
Scarface. That's not fiction. That was a documentary. That's exactly what it was like growing up.
Wow, that's awesome. And that's crazy. So he just drove down, did he have interviews lined up, or was it
interviews? He had an afternoon of interviews lined up, and he was basically he got offered a job and he's like, "I'll take it." Because, we're Jewish, from Brooklyn, and my mom was like, "Oklahoma, our people aren't in Oklahoma."
No, I grew up in the Midwest now.
Right? Yeah. And, funnily enough, I've married a Catholic from Cincinnati. So
there you go.
But it's funny because they said you can either go to Oklahoma, or they also offered California. And at that time he was like, California? You might as well have told him he was going to the moon, right? It was so far away. But it's funny because, you really, I think, only know what's out in the world from where you currently sit. So at that moment, it seemed like California seemed so far away.
Oh, yeah.
And now it's like you get on an airplane and you're there for lunch, So it's just such a funny thing to think about. The decisions that we make in our lives are so often based on just lack of perspective and information and knowledge about what's out there in the big bad world.
I think that's such a great call. Yeah, it's common. I think about it even when it applies to business too. It's you think about people come with a plan or a project plan, and so often what I see, it's what are the alternatives? And and it's that perspective, I think, that helps us all make our best decisions, is just to think about not just what the path forward is, but what are all the alternatives. And I think, like you said, that comes from just really being able to take maybe a step back and think through some of those decisions ahead of time. And I think it's so interesting. He drove to Miami too. I can just imagine this, 70, just driving down, in the uniform and interviewing at all these places. It's such an interesting thing to think about, like you said, perspective.
Yeah, it's funny because you think about it, he was actually helping put people into outer space. He was helping put people on the moon, but California seemed insane.
Right.
So he drove
that's perspective.
And he drove down to Miami in his he actually had a Corvette. He had this T-top Corvette, and it was gold. And I don't know if he actually bought that after he got to Miami or before, but in my mind, he drove to Miami
he's cruising.
in his uniform, like with his little shades on, like driving down there. His gold, like old, like the old. It wasn't a Stingray, but it was like just after the Stingray era, so it had that like long, beautiful.
Yeah, I know
nose
exactly which one.
It.
Yeah,
yeah.
I love
Miami.
that. And so, what was it like growing up? And I mean, again, like you talked about, like Scarface era, but what are some things you remember, maybe lessons from your family in those days and through high school?
It's the funniest thing about growing up in Miami is it's something that I didn't really clock until Barack Obama was elected president. Everyone's like, we're post-race now. And I was like, what are you talking about? Like, we are more like separated now than we were when I was growing up. Like, I grew up in a high school that was 1/3 white, 1/3 Latino, and 1/3 black. And among the white kids, you had the kids that were on food stamps. You had the kids who lived in houses with yachts in their backyard. With the Latinos, you had the Cubans, you had, you had Venezuelans, you had the Panamanians. I mean, you had people whose families came over pre-marial boat lift and post-marial boat lift. Among the blacks, there were the Haitians, there were the Dominicans, there were the African Americans. I mean, it was like there was one of every stripe in my high school. You had poor kids, you had rich kids, you had Jewish kids, you had Episcopalian kids. I mean, you had everything. We didn't have a ton of Asian kids, although we had some, but it just like, it was such a bouillabaisse then. And I just feel like, I went from there to University of Texas. And it was funny because I walked onto the University of Texas campus having grown up in a Jewish household that was like, I say we put the ish in Jewish. Like I wasn't bat mitzvahed. We never did anything. We didn't keep kosher. Like there was none of that stuff. Right. But like we could do a good bagel brunch, right? Like we're sort of community Jews as opposed to religious Jews. Right. And I left my high school thinking that I was like white. And I got to Texas and I realized, and I was told I was Jewish, right? And I was like, what? Like, huh? How is that? Because everything was so much more separated outside of Miami. Miami was this just like crazy, like everybody's all on top of each other. And it's like, if you got it, you flaunt it. If you don't got it, you still flaunt it. I mean, it was like, everyone was in everybody else's business. There were a million different languages being spoken. And then I got out into the world and I realized that the world is really not like that, and much to its detriment is not like that.
How did you pick UT then? Out of all the schools, I mean, I live in Austin as everyone knows, but so I get a chance to see it. And I can tell you right now, there's still, I would say, it's still fairly homogenous, and that was one of my big shocks when I moved here from Brooklyn was that, and so I can imagine even back. I mean, like if that's where it's at now, like, and it's still, I think, extremely homogenous.
Yes.
I can't imagine what it could have been like, 20, 30 years ago. And so what was the thought process about UT? Like, how did you decide, to kind of take like such a dramatic leap?
I decided to apply there because I wanted to go to a big school that had like football. Like I used to watch a lot of football with my dad growing up, and I wanted to be able to tell people where I went to school and them to be able to go, oh, okay, like they'd heard of it. I knew I wasn't getting into Harvard, Princeton, Yale, right? And I knew I wanted to get the hell out of Florida. So, I applied to, big state schools. And my parents, in their infinite wisdom, took me to visit a whole bunch of schools like Northwestern, Michigan, Texas in February.
So there you go. Well, that was sold. That was like done.
So we went to go look at all these schools, and everybody's like miserable, and it's gray, and it's windy, and it's snowy, and it, like it's not just like beautiful snow. It was like those days where it's like gray and cruddy and disgusting. And then we get to University of Texas, and there's cute boys without shirts playing frisbee on the quad, and it was like, yep, I'm home. I mean, I wish I could say that there was more to it. I knew I wanted to study government, political science, and I knew I wanted to study journalism, and I knew that Texas had great, great majors in both of those areas. But yeah, I mean, looking back on it, I probably would have been very happy at like a small liberal arts college in the Northeast in terms of like who I am as a human. But I didn't know those schools even existed at that time. I mean, my parents went to Brooklyn College for like $7.50 and a sandwich. I mean, that's like the options that I knew about were like you go to Harvard, Princeton, Yale, or there's community college, and in between there's like state schools.
There's like Miami, Florida State.
That was really all I knew. And I knew, I went to a high school where I graduated. I started 10th grade with about 1,200 kids, and I graduated 12th grade with 624. So we had quite an attrition rate in my high
Wow.
school. And probably less than 50 went to college. We had a lot of trade schools, a lot of military, a lot of like just, GEDs. That's it. So, I didn't come out of like, pedigree central thinking in the way that I live in New England now. And it's like everybody, like you can't throw a stone with hitting a prep school or a PhD.
That's right. Well, and how much time you spent on the Cape is how you were judged.
Yes.
Right?
Well, it's funny because I always say to people, everywhere you live, there's currency. Right?
Of course.
Like in Miami, it's like, how big is your boat and who does your plastic surgery? In Boston, it's where do your kids prep and where do you summer? In Austin, it's like, which startup are you involved in? Right? I mean, like everywhere has a certain currency. And I like a currency that's about like thinking. Like in Boston, it's like, where do your kids prep and where do you summer? But people also ask you like, what books are you reading? And, they want to know what you're working on. Like the currency here is a little more cerebral, than Miami. Like I love visiting Miami, but I always leave Miami feeling like the fattest, palest, ugliest, but also smartest person on the planet.
Yeah, Miami's evolving. Shout out to Miami. Miami, actually through the pandemic, Miami's government did an amazing job of doing a ton of incentives to get people to grow up, and they kind of tried to rival Austin and like that next kind of up city, I think. Yes. And so I know there's a lot more going on there. So you go to UT.
There's a whole area in Miami called Wynwood. That exactly. Literally, like Wynwood, for people who don't know it, is like the arts district. Like you go and there's beautiful like graffiti all over the walls, and there's drag brunches, and there's all kinds of boutiques. When I was growing up, that's where we bought our drugs. Like it was Overtown. Like it was a slum. It was where we bought our drugs. And a friend of mine owns a restaurant there, and he gave me the address like 5 years ago, and he's like, "Come for brunch when you're in town." And I was like, "Oh, I must have written that down wrong. That can't be where it is." And I was like, "Oh no, that's where it is."
That's like the new area. It's like the new area.
It's a whole new. So shout out to Miami, yes.
There you go. So, all right. So, you go to UT. When did the government kind of, I won't call it an obsession, but when did like the government, when like I guess like what point did you know? I mean, obviously you said you knew you wanted to study government coming into college. So, like, what was it about that? Like, where do you think that comes from? Like, that desire to want to get into service and public service.
Yeah. I can tell you exactly where it comes from. It came from the Iranian hostage crisis in the Carter administration in 1979. So when I was growing up, there used to be, back before we had 24/7 cable news, you'd watch the 6 o'clock news, right? Like you'd just watch it at night while you were having dinner. And my parents were very interested in current events. And my dad was a Republican. My mom was a Democrat. Still are to this day. And we would watch the 6 o'clock news. And at the end of the news anchor would come on and they would do like an editorial, right? And the editorial wasn't like the way that we see editorials today, like Rachel Maddow or Tucker.
Well, it was illegal back then. I think it was illegal to do that type of like slant to it.
Exactly. So they would come on like in the last 5 minutes of the 6 o'clock news hour, and it would be like an editorial from, and it was like Dwight Lauderdale, Miami, the NBC affiliate in Miami. And he would talk about what he thought about, the school board or the environment, the EPA protections or the Iranian hostage crisis. And I remember as a 8 or 9 year old just being so incensed, so just righteously indignant that the most powerful country in the world could not get our people back from some place in the middle of the Middle East. Right? I could not understand it. And I kept a little notepad where I was counting the days. I'm like 179 days. And I go to dinner the next time, it's 180 days. And I remember just being so beside myself that we couldn't just fix this. Why can't we just go get them? Right? I grew up thinking that America, the beautiful, the powerful, we could do anything we set our mind to. I was fed all the stories in history class about the great American nation. And then all of a sudden there's a handful of people and we literally can't get them. And they're showing video of them with hoods over their heads. And I'm like, how can this be? And I remember being so angry about that. And then Ronald Reagan came into office and immediately they were released. Of course, I look back on it now and I know that there's all sorts of internal machinations and, games that are being played and all that. But as a kid, I remember thinking, okay, you put the right people in office and they solve the problems. I'm going to solve the problems. And I was like, I'm going to run for Senate because of course I didn't think girls could be president back then. I mean, please, can we make a girl a president? But at that point, I thought you had to be like a straight rich white dude. Like that's what they looked like.
I mean, yeah.
Yeah, for the most part, they still do. And rich, of course, because Jimmy Carter wasn't, and he was a failure in my estimation because I looked at him and I thought, well, he couldn't get the hostages out. So I, in that moment, was like, I'm going to run for office. And so I decided that I was going to become a lawyer and I was going to, run for office and I was going to solve all the problems. And that plan suited me fairly well until I got to law school, where I realized I had no interest in being a lawyer. So that's fast forwarding a little bit. But yeah, that is exactly where it took root.
Yeah, and how did you? So, obviously, then after you graduate, and we'll get into that. You graduate, you immediately go into you're working on the Clinton Gore campaign, and then transition team. So, you're immediately kind of moving into some interesting roles here. And then again, as you kind of go into like special assistant to the director, so pretty quickly you're moving into some I think what people on the outside would say is like some pretty legit interesting. Roles. So, what were those first, you think about kind of like pre-law school, what were those first years that you remember, getting into politics and maybe, I don't know if there's like a reality, like, was there a reality at some point or like, how did that like shape you going forward?
So it's the interesting thing about it is at University of Texas, I had the privilege of taking a class from Sarah Weddington. And Sarah Weddington was the woman who argued Roe v. Wade in front of the Supreme Court when she was all of 27 years old. So Sarah had gone to University of Texas Law School, graduated in the 70s, and at that point, no law firms in Texas were hiring lady lawyers. So she went to go work for legal services, and in one day to legal services walks Jane Roe. And so Sarah gets the case, not because she was the smartest or the most experienced or the best funded, but because she just happened to be the most proximate. And then she took the case, to Texas Supreme Court, to the United States Supreme Court. And she told us in this class that we took from her that the reason that she won, the reason she was able to win was because she knew all the rules. She studied the history. She studied the procedural book. She studied everything. And so she was able to dance circles around all these, booted up lawyers. And that to me, I think was the most formative experience that I had about leadership as a young person. I graduated from college early and started law school early. I was in the January class, and the January class is one of those weird classes where there are people that are coming back to school after taking time off to, have a different career, raise kids. And I remember looking around and just being like, I am the youngest person here. I was 20 years old. I'm the youngest person here.
Oh, wow.
And I don't necessarily look up to the professors. I don't necessarily gel with the students. Like I was just like, it just wasn't my place. It didn't work. And I remember thinking that law was going to be the way that I figured out all the rules. Like that was going to be it. Like, the rules and you can win the game. And what I realized was most of the people were so busy trying to just compete with each other and like rip the case law out of the textbooks in the library so that nobody else could do it. I mean, again, this is like pre-internet times. And I just remember being so disgusted about that. So what I did was, what most people do when they're in a bad situation is I dated somebody who was terrible for me.
Let's just compound it.
This is like the real story behind super impressive resume, right? It turns out I dated a guy who gave me a ride home from campus one day. I had ridden my bike and it was raining, and he's like, I'll just stick your bike in the back of my IROC Z. Which
that should have been your first signal.
Tells you
that should have been your first signal.
Right? So he sticks my bike in the back of his IROC Z, and blasting Def Leppard or whatever. Yeah. And he was like, "But before I drop you off, we got to stop at this guy's campaign office. He's running for president." Again, this is pre-internet. So in order to get information, you had to like stop at somebody's like local strip mall office and like pick up a piece of paper that literally had like writing on it about their stances on policy. And I was like, Governor who? From where? Arkansas, not a chance in hell, right? Like, no fucking way. George H.W. Bush had just won Desert Storm. He had a 91% approval rating. The Democrats were looking for any sacrificial lamb to throw on the ticket. And I was like, there's not a chance, right? Not a chance. And then we walk into this little teeny strip mall in Gainesville, Florida, where there's this black and white TV in the corner. And on the black and white TV is then Governor Bill Clinton, brown hair, right? Like giving this impassioned plea about service and saying, there's nothing wrong with America that can't be fixed with what's right with America, which I still believe to this day, by the way. And he offered as a solution service, this idea of community service in exchange for college tuition. And in that moment, what I realized was that needs to happen. Like it was like lightning bolt moment. Yeah. And I went from the like, I'm going to run for office, I'm going to solve all the problems, to we need to get the right person in the right place, right? This is like the theme that now is like coming through, the right person in the right place so that they can do the right things. And what needs to happen is not me being in law school and running for office and putting the attention on me, but rather me stopping what I'm doing, helping him get elected, because that idea needs to happen. Like that needs to happen. Change yourself while you change the community. Amazing, right? Everybody wins. Everybody's lifted up. And so I started volunteering on the campaign, and 3 weeks later, all four principals, Bill and Hillary and Al and Tipper Gore, all came to Gainesville. And we got 36,000 people to show up at this rally. So that got the attention of the national office. And they were like, who are those volunteers? Let's hire them. And by the way, hire them means like we'll pay them all the ramen soup and idealism they can eat and disrupt their lives and put them on a campaign bus and throw them all over the country throwing rallies. So that's what I did. And along the way, I started meeting people who were other volunteers, and those volunteers ended up moving to DC when Bill Clinton was elected. And so I was like, oh, okay, well, I don't want to go back to law school, so maybe I should do that. So I like put my car on the auto train and I took the overnight train up to DC, and I got off the train. I had nowhere to live. I didn't know a soul. And I just started like going to payphones and like calling people that I'd met along the way. And one thing led to another, and they invited me to come volunteer in the transition. And then that got into being invited to volunteer in the White House. And I ended up in the office that created that very program, which became AmeriCorps, which more than 1 million young people have served in to this day.
Yeah, that's amazing. And what was that? I mean, what was that AmeriCorps journey like for you? I mean, obviously that was a kind of a big part of like late 90s for you in particular. Like what was that experience like, and what are maybe some like learnings or takeaways you had from that?
Yeah. There were a couple, and I talk about some of these in my book, Limitless. One of the biggest learnings is that nobody knows what the fuck they're doing. Right. Right. So, okay. And
you see these people, you're just like, oh, these people obviously have it all together, right? They know exactly what's going on.
Yeah. And it turns out
nobody knows.
And it's fairly funny because when, there were people who were in that office at the time who were like grown-ups, like they knew what they were doing. They had like, right. I mean, I was literally still wearing my mother's hand-me-down suits from the 80s. I was like Alexis Carrington showing up, with these like giant shoulder pads. They had their own clothes, right? Like, let alone like they were married, mortgages, washer dryers. I'm like, they're grown-ups. And I remember 10 years ago when I turned 40, I ran into one of them and I was like, I'm the same age or older than you were then. And you seemed like you knew what you were doing, and I still have no idea. And they were like, Laura, we didn't know what we were doing. We were all making it up as we went along. And so I can tell you that story in two ways. The first way is the real way, and the second sort of a funny anecdote. So I would walk in and I would look at all the other young people who were there, like around this beautiful giant mahogany table for staff meetings. And they would walk in with, their fancy little briefcases and their like New York Times and their Wall Street Journals, all like dog-eared and highlighted. And they'd sit at the meetings before they'd start, and they'd be like writing furiously on their notepads, all their brilliant ideas. And I remember like looking around and I was like, I don't have any ideas.
I got nothing.
I got nothing. Like, I don't have a copy of the paper. I'm still got my backpack from college. Like, I'm literally wearing my mother's suits. Like, I don't have any ideas? Like, what are they writing? So I would sit there and I'd like kind of like hide the pad so nobody could see. And I would just like pretend to write things, or I'd write like a list of things like pick up the dry cleaning, or like I'd write like a grocery list. Like I felt like I had to,
you just wrote words like business, like business,
I wrote
politics.
I wrote ideas. I was like, I didn't know what I was doing. And here's the problem. Like, I was so busy trying to fake it till I make it that I ended up so busy pretending to know what I was doing that I missed all of the conversations that were happening around me and the relationships that were being formed and the way that people like casually interact with each other, because I was so busy trying to look like I had my shit together that I didn't learn anything. And not only did I not learn anything, I was able to fake it till I made it to a certain point, and then I got there and it was like built on a house of cards, right? I didn't actually have any of the mistakes that you make along the way that teach you things. So, that's how I learned that nobody really knows what they're doing. Like, we're all figuring it out, and the way to actually know what you're doing is to make those mistakes.
Fail. And try.
Right? To fail. So that's the first thing. And then the second, to really put this into stark contrast for your listeners, is that every administration plays a prank on the next administration coming in. It's like just like a historical thing. It's like when George W. Bush won, the Clinton administration took all the W's off of the keyboards, like on every keyboard, right? Like that was just like the prank. When HW lost and Bill Clinton came in, the HW administration actually took all of the extension numbers off of the phones. So literally, like the leader of the free world, and you think there's like a smooth transition of power. And meanwhile, on day one, we're all there like 0001. Hi, this is Laura from National Service. Who are you? 0002. Hi, this is Laura. Who are you? Right. This is what was going on for the first few hours of the Clinton administration. So literally nobody knows what they're doing or who the hell to call in order to figure it out. So I think that was a really important lesson.
Yeah.
And then the second lesson I will say is that you have to make your future. You have to make your future. Nobody's going to hand it to you. I was there for 6 weeks and I was busy like doing like data entry, like the peoniest of peon, like I think only the guy who got the coffee for the guy who got the coffee for the guy who got the coffee was below me.
He was like lower on the totem pole. Yeah.
Yeah. He's the only one who was lower on the totem pole, although he wouldn't get me coffee. Like he wasn't
no,
that much lower than
your
me.
Peer level. Your peer level at that point.
In his mind. Right. But I was like, I've got a keyboard. Sorry. So I was doing data entry, and at one point the head of the office, a man by the name of Eli Siegel, to whom I actually dedicated my first book and who was a mentor and a real father figure to me. He came up to me and he was like, hi, you seem like you're working really hard, and I have a project that needs getting done. Would you want to do it? And I was like, who are you? You talking to me? Yes. So he says this. I've always wondered about this question. John F. Kennedy proposed the Peace Corps, and it was a success from like the minute he signed it in the Rose Garden. Lyndon Baines Johnson created the war on poverty, and it was a failure from before it was even out the gates. Can you figure out why? Because, when we start this, national service program, we don't want that to be the case. It's like, okay, so no big deal. Just like a casual little assignment. No problem.
Yeah,
right?
Of course. That's going to like influence, millions of people later.
Sure. No problem. Yeah. I'll just gather up my things. So I gather up my stuff and I stick it in my college backpack, and I'm walking out the door to go to the Library of Congress. Cause again, this is mostly pre-internet, right? Like we didn't even have email. Like we were still sending inter-office mail with like the little guy with the cart, at the White House at this time. So kids, it's been 87 years, right? Like I'm old. So I gather up my stuff and I'm walking out the door to go to the Library of Congress, and the chief of staff comes up to me and he was like, Laura, listen. And he's this like 6 foot tall guy in a fancy suit and a fancy haircut. And he's like leans his overly muscular arm on my shoulder just a little bit too much, that like physical intimidation thing.
Yeah, exactly. Like I'm in charge.
Yeah. He was like, he's letting me know. And he goes, listen, Eli's a very busy man, and he's not going to have time to read your whole report. So why don't you do this? You go do the report and give it to me, and I'll I'll summarize and put a cover memo on it for him. Great. Scurry along. And he gives me that like hand flick motion, like go, like it's Delaware's Prada. We're done.
Yeah.
So I start walking out the door, and a woman comes up to me who watched this whole scene go down. And in my mind, she was one of those women who knew what she was doing at the time. Again, she was also still making it up, but she was like, "Do you know what's happening here, right?" And I was like, yeah, sure. Yeah, maybe. So, no, what's going on? She's like, he's going to screw you. He's totally going to take you. He's going to fuck you. Like, what are you doing? And I'm like, what can I do? I'm like an intern. I'm literally getting paid in ramen soup. Like he's got me dead to rights. There's nothing I can do. And she's like, all right, this is what you're going to do. You're going to go do the report. Eli wants it in a week. You're going to give it to him tomorrow. Okay. Challenge number 1. You're going to give it to him tomorrow and you're going to give it to him. So you'll give it to him. You'll also give a copy to the chief of staff. But when you give it to Eli, say, listen, your chief of staff is going to summarize this for you. But I thought you'd just like the raw data, just in case. So that's what I did, right? Like fast forward to the scene of me like dot matrix printout, bzz, 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 like printing this thing out, handing it to him. You're going to get this summarized, but I thought you'd like to see the raw data as he's walking out the door the end of the next day. And then I go home to my basement apartment with the roaches and the rats, and I cry into my ramen soup about the job I'm never going to get because I've already
you're getting fired myself. For sure. Yeah.
So I walk in the next day and Eli walks up to me. He's like, I read your report. It was good. I told my chief of staff to put you on payroll. Oh my God. And so I walk into the chief of staff's office and he says, and this is almost a direct quote. Yeah. So Eli told me to put you on payroll. And I did some research about what the lowest possible number I could give you is. So here you go. $22,717 sign here. And by the way, if you ever do that again, I'm going to fucking ruin you.
Oh, man.
But that's how I got my job in the White House.
That's right. You had to make it happen.
Your own future. You have to make it happen. And sometimes it was like, I wasn't going to get it otherwise, right? It was like, I had nothing to lose. I had everything to win. And sometimes you just need somebody to sort of bang you over the head and be like, he's going to fuck you. Like you have to, this is your moment. Take it. Go.
I love that. And that kind of gets, obviously I want to spend some time. You then kind of make the transition to the nonprofit sector and, publish your first book, 2007, another one, 2015, talking about, mission driven, moving from profit to purpose. Like at what point, and then let's talk a little bit about Limitless too. What was that transition like for you? And like, what was like, those transitions from wanting to kind of move into that? Because as you moved into AmeriCorps, you kind of start to go down this service route. And then, you start to move into like the combination of kind of corporate plus service. So like what was that, in the few minutes, like what was that transition like for you? Meaning like what was it like, were there some key moments you like remember things like kind of like extrapolating to the next thing?
Yeah. So at the end of 4 years in the White House, I turned to Eli, and Eli had run the 92 campaign and he was leaving to run the 96 campaign again. And I remember saying, I'm ready to go. I'm ready to get back on the campaign trail. And Eli said, you're 25 now and you're kind of too old to get back on campaign buses and, eat cold pizza and sleep on high school gymnasium floors. Cause 25 is like a million in campaign years. And you're also too young to be the domestic policy advisor. So go talk to my friend Arnie Miller. And he'll find you a job in the nonprofit sector. He runs the biggest search firm in the nonprofit sector, and you'll find a job there and then come back and do something big on the Gore campaign. And I was like, great, awesome, sounds terrific. So I sit down with Arnie, and within 5 minutes, I was like, wait a minute, your office is in Boston. The boy I'm dating now, who doesn't drive an IROC Z, who is the one, he's about to move to Boston. I should come work for you. And he's like, you should come work for me. And I was like, great. I'll take the job. What do you do now? And so that's how I became a headhunter. But the headhunting space is an interesting space because it what do you do when you leave the White House when you're 25 years old? You have no ostensible real skills, but you have a Rolodex that can choke a horse. Right? You become a matchmaker. You fix people up. I've always been fascinated by people. And I love that you do your interviews this way because for 20 years as a recruiter, I would always start with like, tell me, about your mom, your dad, a teacher, a coach, somebody in your life who was instrumental, like, who you model yourself after. And I would do this not quite like on the psychologist couch type interview, but very much a biographical interview because I do think there are these traits that we find that either you can't fight City Hall and they come to you through your DNA, or they are role modeled, nature versus nurture. They're role modeled for you so often, both good and bad, that it's interesting to see them at play. So someone will talk about their type A personality. And then later they'll talk about trouble they're having in managing somebody. And you're like, oh, is that because of the control freak stuff you got from your dad? And you can like sort of bring some of these things in. So I spent 5 years working for Arnie, by the way, to whom I dedicated my second book, right? So these are my two mentors, and I dedicated one of each book to each of them. And then I had this moment where I realized that I wasn't part of the solution. So,
right.
When you realize you're not part of the solution, it leaves you in only one place, which is that you're part of the problem. I realized that the traditional model of executive search just didn't work for a lot of the nonprofit sector. So the traditional model is you charge 1/3 of the first year's cash compensation, which is, pretty, that's pretty much the way the entire sector does it, whether it's for profit or nonprofit. And if you're doing a search for, say, the Ford Foundation, and they're paying their chief strategy officer $300,000, that means you're making a $100,000 fee on that search. If you're doing a search for a local domestic violence shelter for a director of fundraising of development, and they're paying the person $60,000, you're making $20,000. So if you are me and you're a young person who wants to make partner in that firm, who are you more incentivized to spend time with? The big one. I would also argue that the chief strategy officer at the Ford Foundation is a much easier search than a development director for a small domestic violence shelter. Yeah. It's complicated and complex, and they're difficult, but it's like different, right? It is not as difficult. And so I found that like my last 5% of my energy every day was being given to the clients who I felt needed us the most. And so I walked into Arnie's office one day and I'm like, there's a better way. And he was like, there's the door. It's like, you could keep doing things our way. We love you. You're great. You're doing a great job. Or you could leave if you want to do things your way. And I just, like I said, once I realized I wasn't part of the solution that I had heretofore thought I was part of, I couldn't live that way. And so I started my own firm. And I then ran that firm with this very different business model of creating budgets for searches based on the complexity of the work, but also based on how much capacity we could leave with the client long term. And it just became much more consonant with who I was. I was no longer trying to like build the bottom line of this firm by doing like the biggest, flashiest searches, but I was actually trying to create the most amount of impact in the sector. While at the same time running the firm, I founded it when my oldest was 6 weeks old. So I was running the firm from my house. So it was much more consonant with what I needed as a human. I was able to create a life where my work and my life were aligned and not just balanced. And that really became, I think, the beginnings of what became the model that's in Limitless, is how you figure out how to do the work, like how what you do matches who you are in a way that you're not working at cross purposes or exhausting yourself trying to be a different person in each space. And so I ran that business, then I grew it and I ran it, a huge international search firm over the course of the next 15 years.
Yeah. And it's, such a great story again. And I think it's kind of interesting. The book came out in 2019, but with everything that happened in last year and this year about this idea of alignment, right? And that this kind of the concept of work and life and balance and what we're supposed to do and actually what that looks like for the individual, I feel like has leapt forward. And so, you know, in a big way. And so as we kind of, we wrap up here, I'd love you maybe talk a little bit about Limitless and, what are some like the core themes that, I guess like were most true for you and we'll put a link to the book so everyone can go check it out and buy a copy. But as you think about this and like the passion now of, as you move forward, like, what's exciting, like talk a little bit about the kind of core tenets and then like what you're excited about, again, as we kind of look at this new world of where more and more people are thinking about alignment.
Yeah, I think a lot of people woke up around May or June or July of 2020 last year and said, when life goes back to normal, is the normal I'm going back to really the life I want? Mm-hmm. And for the majority of people, as witnessed by the Great Resignation, the answer to that was a resounding hell fucking no. Right? Like people didn't want it because we've all been told our whole lives about what makes a job good. Like what makes a good job good is the mission of the company. Does the leader inspire me? How much money am I going to make? How many skills am I going to learn? How big is my reach going to be? How long is my commute going to be? How prestigious will it look on my resume? Things like that. But nobody ever said, hey, Jake, you should prioritize that list. at every stage of your life to figure out what makes a good job good for you, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, I have done research over the last 3 years that have shown that only 37% of the workforce actually says money is their number one top priority. Right? It's up there, but it's not the number one. There are all kinds of other things. Like, does this job allow me to manifest my values on a daily basis? Does it allow me to have the career trajectory that I want? Does it allow me to feel like I'm connected and my work actually matters? Like, there are things that actually matter. And so Limitless came out of this idea when I sat down one day and I said, well, why did I leave law school? Why did I leave the Clinton administration halfway through? Why did I leave that prestigious that prestigious search firm when I was at my best? And after 15 years, why did I sell my firm to my people when I could have just ridden off into the sunset? And it was because at each time my life had changed and the world had changed, that I wanted something different. And I also thought about the thousands of people that I interviewed over the course of those 20 years who were actually, even though they were super successful with what they were doing, they were pretty easy to recruit away because they weren't very happy.
Yeah.
And I thought, if success doesn't lead to happiness, then what does? And what I realized is that this idea of consonance that I talked about earlier, what is consonant with who you are? And consonance is alignment. It's flow. It's like, it's when you feel like the very best of what you do is being called upon to solve a problem at hand, a problem you actually care about. And that problem, the solution, solving that problem, gives you a reward that's actually meaningful to you. And so in the book, I talk about consonance as having 4 things: calling, connection, contribution, and control. So calling, Jake, it's the gravitational force, the thing that gets you out of bed in the morning. Yeah. It's the business you want to build, the podcast you want to grow. It's the family you want to nurture. It's the cause you want to solve, a leader who inspires you, something like that thing that makes you go, that it gets you excited. Connection. Does your work actually connect to that calling? What's on your to-do list, your email, your calendar? Does it actually matter to you? And do you understand how it matters to this calling that you want to serve? Then there's contribution. If connection is all about the work, contribution is really about you. How does this work allow you? Does it contribute to your ability to live the life you want, have the lifestyle you desire, manifest those values through your work, have that career trajectory that you want? How does this work contribute to the life that you want? And then lastly is control. And control really answers the question, do you have any personal agency at all to impact the teams to which you're assigned, the projects that you get, whether or not you're in line for the promotion, how much your hustle pays you, in return? Can you control how much your work connects to that calling and how much it contributes to your life? And so those are the 4 things that make up consonance. And at every age and at every life stage, we want and need different amounts of each of those things. And the only one who can decide that is you. And the problem is that we are so busy giving votes to all the people in our lives who shouldn't have voices, that tell us it's all about the big raise, the big title, the big corner office, the big house, the big car, the big whatever, that we don't say, well, but is that actually going to make me happy? Or will I fill all the check boxes and still feel empty inside?
Mm-hmm. I love, what I love is it's like a very kind of easy checklist for people to kind of work through. And the control one in particular resonates as we're, kind of wrap up. My thought is, what I feel with control is I feel like people have so much more control if they just ask, like you talked about, think about these different things that you've done over your life. And I think people are shocked at, their company, that your leaders probably aren't bad people and their company might want to actually help you. And yes. I think sometimes people, they create this like illusion of non-control because maybe it's easier. You can avoid tough conversations. But man, I got to tell you, you'll be shocked by how many companies, especially today, if you just tell, like you said, this is what I want to do. This is what I think where I can add the value. How many companies will work with you? And try to do that today. Oh,
it's so true. I have so many executives that I coach through the coaching side of my practice who will say things like, "Oh, I've got a salesperson who is so squeaky, and they keep coming into my office like, what have you done for me lately? And they want more and more and more, so I just keep throwing money at them, but I can't keep doing that, right? I can't keep doing that." And then I'm like, "Well, is money what they care about?" And they're like, "Well, I don't know. Mm-hmm. I mean, I assume so." And I'm like, "Yeah, well, why don't you figure out what they care about?" And with almost every single one of them, it turns out that
something else.
There's something else. Like they care about working from home on Fridays, or they care about manifesting those values. So like, let them work from home, put them in charge of your corporate philanthropy, right? If you give them, $10,000 to give away at the end of the year to a charity of, that the whole team votes on, suddenly they're super happy. And it's a whole lot cheaper than the raise that you keep giving them that then puts them back in your office every day. You just have to have those real conversations. And what I'm working on now is actually, so I have a quiz online. There's 4 areas that give you consonants: calling, connection, contribution, and control. But there is a quiz at my4questions.com where you can actually ask yourself 4 questions about these things. And that leads to a deeper assessment that I spent 3 years gathering data on. And I'm working on a white paper now to actually help leaders figure out how to have these conversations about what actually really matters to their workforce. Because, the Great Resignation is being driven in some part by people wanting, livable wages. But for people that are working in idea professions, it's really much more based on wanting 100%. Some kind of consonance in their life.
Yeah, and it's your job as leaders too to pull that out. You can't just wait to. And I think that that's an important story that you just told. And for all the leaders out there listening, that, are you creating the environment to facilitate that? And I think about that a lot for my own company, of like creating that environment where people feel like they can have those conversations.
It's really interesting. I had a friend who's a partner in a big VC firm, and she's like, I don't know, we did the survey, and it turns out that we have a trust problem. How can we have a trust problem? People don't trust our leaders. How can that be? Like, we're so open. We talk to them about everything. And I'm like, well, do you? Like, you talk to them about everything about where the firm's going.
Yeah,
and,
exactly.
The big picture, but like, do you talk to them about how it affects their actual life? So I was like, here's the studies. Like, less than 50% of the workforce feel like they actually have any idea how their work connects to what's going on. And 90% of them tell you that they do their best work when they understand how their work impacts the bigger picture.
Exactly.
So like, you can tell them about the bigger picture, but if you're not telling them about how their work is actually part of it, you're just Charlie Brown's teacher, like, wah, 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 and they don't care. You're lecturing them and they're burnishing their resume.
I think that's a great point to wrap up on. So Laura, thank you so much. There's so much goodness in here, and I know the audience is going to really love it. And so I want to say a big thank you to you for joining me.
Thank you so much, Jake. It's been fun.
All right, awesome. And thank you, everyone. We will see you next week on the next episode of the Jake Dunlap Show. All right, thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in to another extremely fun and interesting episode. I thought it was fun and interesting, so I hope you did too, of the Jake Dunlap Show. Really great, just breaking down everything that makes people who they are, the success, the trials and errors, and I hope that you enjoyed it as much as I did. Make sure to subscribe on your favorite platform, and make sure, more than anything, to go over to jakedunlap.com. That's where you're going to stay up to date on all the latest guests, additional details, prep notes. We're going to be sharing everything on jakedunlap.com. So go ahead, go over there. You can subscribe there as well too, and we will see you next week on the Jake Dunlap Show.